Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Noah Rauch. I'm the Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs here at the Memorial Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all tonight. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members, and I see some familiar faces, so thank you for coming back, and to everyone tuning in to our live web broadcast. On May 1st, 2011, Special Operation Forces carried out a raid on a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, ending the 10-year hunt for Osama bin Laden after 9/11. And during the raid, U.S. Navy SEALs spent an extra 18 minutes collecting computers and hard drives. In her recently published book, The Bin Laden Papers, How the Abbottabad Raid Revealed the Truth About al-Qaeda, its leader, and his family, Nelly Lahoud distills the contents of nearly 6,000 pages of Arabic language private communications that were recovered during those 18 minutes. Tonight, in conversation with Museum Director Clifford Chanin, she will discuss what bin Laden's files revealed about his family, his close associates, and al-Qaeda in the aftermath of 9/11. It is wonderful to welcome Dr. Lahoud back. I'm now going to give you a little of her bio. She's an associate professor in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. She's also a senior fellow in New America's International Security Program. Fluent in Arabic and French, Dr. Lahoud's research has focused on the evolution and ideology of al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Bin Laden Papers, her recent book, was published with Yale University Press and was featured on CBS's 60 Minutes. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Nelly Lahoud, in conversation with Cliff Chanin.
Thank you, Noah. Let's cut to the bottom line. If you have any interest in what bin Laden was up to or wasn't up to in the years, and what his life was like, you've got to read the book, okay? That's just to start. I'm also thrilled we're back in the light of day, which really feels very different. And welcome everybody for coming out of this beautiful day. And we are with someone who is going to shed light on a dark subject. So you see what I did there? Yeah, okay. So I want to start, Nelly, because you have been so immersed in these matters over the years. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about where you come from, what piqued your interest, why this was something you wanted to really devote your career to doing.
If I may, let me first say that I am deeply honored to be speaking with you here today, Cliff, particularly in this very important spot. I'm also very grateful for the very helpful conversations that you and I have had during the course of writing this book. And if I may have a short disclaimer, all the views that I would be presenting today are based on my own research findings. They do not represent necessarily the views of the US Army, the Department of Defense, or the US government more generally. To your question, I have the advantage of being a native Arabic speaker. I grew up in Beirut, Lebanon. And when I was pursuing my graduate studies in Australia, I decided to put my language skills to use. I was very fortunate to study with some great scholars who were not just political theorists, but also historians and philologists. Let me name my PhD supervisors, Tony Johns, Tony Street, and the late Barry Hindus. They instilled in me the importance of reading documents in the original, and that I should not dare to write about documents until I have read them many, many times over, which is what I did with the documents. In the US, I had the great fortune to benefit from the mentorship of Michael Cook, the great Arabist and historian of Islam, and he kindly read all the chapters of the book and was immensely helpful, his feedback. Now, specifically my interest in the documents, it goes back to 2012. I was teaching at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and that year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released or declassified through the CTC, the Combating Terrorism Center, the first batch of documents, there were about 17 documents, maybe around 170 pages in total. And at the time, my boss, Colonel Liam Collins, asked me to lead the study that accompanied the release of these documents. And then subsequently, after that, the ODNI went on to declassify several batches of documents on its own website. Now, it was convenient to do so through the ODNI because they were also declassifying only the internal communications, which was very helpful. And the reason I say this is because in November 2017, it's the CIA this time that declassified everything that they're going to declassify. Now,
which constitutes how many documents at that point?
A massive volume of documents. According to their websites, it's about 470,000 files. Now, this was daunting to go through this. And within a few months of the release, I had the great fortune of meeting Peter Bergen at a conference. Of course, I knew Peter Bergen's work, and it turned out that he knew of mine, and he gave me his full support to join New America. And I was able to work on these documents. But just to say a little bit more about that support, as I said, we're talking about thousands and thousands of files. Now, the CIA did not really release just the internal documents. They released everything that was recovered on the hard drives. This meant all sorts of documents. I must have clicked on, probably a couple of thousands before I determined that the text files were the most important, because there were also videos as well as audios on these files. And so I had about nearly 97,000 files to go through. And that's why it was very helpful, because New America allowed me to work with 2 research assistants who were native Arabic speakers like me, and were able to go through the 97,000 files and I identify which ones were the internal communication.
Which is about 6,000 files.
About 6,000 Arabic pages. And that's really when I could really start working on these documents and put together the book.
So to set this a little bit more clearly for us, what period of time do those 6,000 documents cover? And when you say internal documents, what do you mean specifically in terms of who were they going to and coming from? We'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of how these documents moved, but just trying to get a little more clarity on what the documents actually were.
So thousands of, apart from the 6,000 Arabic pages, the bulk of the documents turned out to be materials that you could really find in the public source. So it could be newspaper articles, it could be videos of news reports, it could be books that they had them downloaded, and so on. So quite a lot of it was of no interest to me. I was very interested in terms of what they were saying with each other.
Internal to al-Qaeda
internal
and
to
internal
al-Qaeda,
to the family.
To al-Qaeda, everybody was the personal was also political, right, as I make it clear in the book. And so, and we have, even though not everything was internal, but the 6,000 Arabic pages, they are brimming with revelations, because they allow us to chronicle al-Qaeda's history post 9/11. And we have documents, covering all these years. And even though some documents are missing, you can still reconstruct some of what happened during those missing years from the existing documents that exist, from the letters that we still have. So 6,000 pages they have ample information to allow us to chronicle the key events that shaped al-Qaeda post 9/11.
Post 9/11 and post its departure from Afghanistan.
Right.
Its protected shelter there. But one of the fascinating things that emerges from this is bin Laden is, in those early years, giving advice and trying to set a marker for how his associates should be protecting themselves, because the American presence is closing in on them in various ways. And contrary to the idea that these fighters should just continue their fighting from wherever they are, the most interesting thing is his command to them, or his order to them, or recommendation, I'm not sure what word to use, is to go into hiding. So you can't be found and the Americans won't kill you.
So one of the most interesting findings that emerged from the letters is that al-Qaeda was effectively shattered by December 2001, and it wasn't able to regain its capability to launch international terrorism. We discover from the letters, the reason why we're going to get to the point about hiding, we discover from the letters that bin Laden had to disappear, according to the letters, out of necessity. And for almost 3 years, he was incommunicado. He wasn't communicating with his associates. We don't know where he was during these 3 years. But at some point in 2004, he was able to resume communications. By this time, al-Qaeda's top leaders had been either killed or detained by Pakistan and Iran. Bin Laden finds to his surprise that they were, as the letters put it, afflicted. They found themselves highly insecure in their own environment. One of the surprising factors is that they began to fear the Afghan Taliban, who found them to be lured by the American dollars and deviated from God's path, according to the letters. So as early as 2004 and even earlier, we find these second-tier leaders of al-Qaeda apprising bin Laden about what happened during the past 3 years, where they were not in contact with him. And we hear of their, to use their own wordings, affliction, aimlessness, and so on. Their advice to him was, we really should pack up and leave and go to Iraq, because at that point there was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had been fighting in Iraq. And so bin Laden's order to them at the time is that you need to hide. Kumun is the technical word that he used. You need to hide until such time that we could resume the work, by which he meant international terrorism. And so effectively, hiding became their modus operandi.
So it sounds from what you're saying that bin Laden, in spite of being in hiding himself, in spite of the fact that he's telling the others to go into hiding, his goal over the longer term was still to resume the work, which was not in Iraq, but which was directly targeting the United States. That seems never to have changed in his assessment of what al-Qaeda should be doing, whether or not it could do it at a given moment.
Absolutely. This was right until the very end. And in fact, as I note in the book, his ability to influence regional jihadi groups was minimal at best. And often he found them to be unreliable and a liability to global jihad, precisely because they were not focused on global jihad, by which he meant attacking the United States.
Right. And so this idea of al-Qaeda as an organization and its individual adherents being afflicted, just tell us a little bit more about what this means, because you've said already that the organization, because of these security concerns, was essentially broken, that it could not do the work that it intended to do. But how did this affliction carry out into the lives of these followers of bin Laden as they were dispersed?
Well, in 2004, after he found out that they were afflicted, he sent out to them, you really need to be hiding. It was very important that any communications you needed to do was not through meetings, but you needed to, he started talking about the closed circle, meaning that you could not communicate in person, and nobody could know where you were. So that was That was mainly his order in 2004. But beyond that, what this really translated into, throughout the time until the very end, until 2011, we find bin Laden itching for international terrorism, and we find his associates having to tell him that we can't move. Initially, it was the impact of Operation Enduring Freedom and so on. But what really devastated them were the drones. The drones were highly effective, so much so that a jihadi, an Arab jihadi, couldn't even take his car to the garage because he could be tracked down. What was interesting in this element is that they managed to find out, according to them, how the drones operated. They believed that they found a nexus between spies on the ground as well as the drones. And according to the letters, the area, and they were mostly concentrated in North Waziristan.
Pakistan. Yeah.
In Pakistan. The area was infested with spies. So clearly the CIA had been doing a very remarkable job. And some of the letters that reached bin Laden suggest that the people were not the jihadis, including al-Qaeda, were not very disciplined in terms of evading the drones. They believed that evading the drones was a simple matter. All you needed to do was to hide and to follow operational security measures and to be disciplined about it. And they couldn't. They couldn't enforce great discipline. What they effectively needed to do was to do what bin Laden was doing and hide in Abbottabad or not move. Anything short of that, they were being tracked. And so from that perspective, they were devastated by the drones. But we also see in the letters that whatever was happening on the global jihadi landscape, it was news to them. They found out about it from the media, and they were mostly spectators about these events. Sometimes they approved and they were cheering. And on other occasions, they found them to be a liability, some of the attacks.
So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of it, because I want to come back to this idea that however they communicated, bin Laden was out of the loop and was always catching up with what was going on in the world. But when you say letters, let's be clear, we're not talking about putting a stamp on an envelope and dropping it in a post box. There was a system by which electronic letters were written. They were put on, I think you say, a SIM card, and they were passed along to whoever the recipient was supposed to be. But tell us a little bit about how that worked, and if you can estimate what the time delay was in the transmission of a letter either from bin Laden or to him and its arrival at the destination.
So the reason why we have these letters is precisely because of what I said earlier, because they were afflicted and they were in hiding. They were in no position to be meeting. Bin Laden, judging by the letters, sometimes in late 2005, I'm going to say, probably was in Abbottabad. I don't know where he was between late 2001 and 2005. There was no internet in the Abbottabad household, and they were not using telephone. Now, how these letters were exchanged, this is rarely, if ever, rarely discussed. For operational security measures, they don't get discussed in the letters. Out of thousands of pages, only one letter describes what they were doing. And we find out that about the close circle that I mentioned earlier, there was an intermediary on the side of bin Laden's associates in North Waziristan, and there was another intermediary on the side of bin Laden, and there was a courier in between. What they did, the letters were being typed on computers in the bin Laden household, and they were saved on a SIM card. It would go into an envelope. Now, the security guards who lived next door with bin Laden, they played a minor role in the outgoing and the incoming of these letters. They would meet the intermediary on bin Laden's side. My hunch is that they would probably meet in Peshawar in a marketplace. Now, the intermediary on the North Waziristan side would also collect the letters from there. His brother-in-law was a courier in between. And so they would hand them eventually from the intermediary to the courier to the intermediary on bin Laden's side. And this intermediary would meet one of the bodyguards of bin Laden. It's a highly complex, almost impenetrable operation. And this is the only way bin Laden was able to evade the authorities for 10 years. Now, the communications between the North Waziristan and regional jihadi groups in various parts of the world, these were done by email, and judging by the letters, they say that they were doubly encrypted. Bin Laden was unhappy about his associates using emails to connect with other jihadi groups. He warned them, but they didn't heed his warnings. Now, just to be clear, they couldn't move. They didn't have the luxury to be able to travel, and the only possibility they had to communicate their influence to other jihadi groups was through these encrypted emails. Bin Laden could tell that these communications were being intercepted, judging by some of the news reports that were being leaked and that he was reading the reports. And so this was the state of communications. How long did they last? Sometimes it could be, sometimes months. But what was interesting about this is that the security of the intermediary and the courier was prioritized over anything else.
Over speed
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that really made it. That this is why we're talking, when we speak about bin Laden's role, we have to consider all these constraints that he had to deal with. In terms of his command of the global jihadi landscape, we have to consider all these elements that were at play, which made him pretty much insignificant in many instances.
So that's, we have this image of bin Laden as the all-powerful leader of, this sort of terrorist supergroup, which proved at least that perception on 9/11. But what you're describing is a person not just who's in hiding and cut off from his troops, but even when he manages to make contact with them, I won't say is powerless, but is not particularly powerful and may be influential under given circumstances, but even that is not certain.
No, and here, initially, the first connection that occurred between bin Laden, or al-Qaeda more precisely, his associates, and other jihadi groups was with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq. Now, in 2004, it was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi who had way more power on the jihadi landscape than bin Laden.
Well, he was active in the battlefield.
He was active, and he had money, and he managed to be able to connect. He sent an envoy to meet with al-Qaeda's leaders. Now, al-Zarqawi wanted to be embraced by al-Qaeda. And the reason why he wanted to be embraced by al-Qaeda is because he was dealing with many factions, jihadi factions in Iraq, and he couldn't unite them. So he thought that by being part of the al-Qaeda brand, the brand that attacked the United States on 9/11, that would give him more credentials in the eyes of others. Bin Laden welcomed the merger, and he thought that, well, this is going to be able to give, he thought that they would do well. He always thought well of his jihadi brothers, that somehow they're going to be focused on international terrorism, that al-Zarqawi would unite jihadis in Iraq and would focus on the United States. Well, none of this happened. They found themselves, al-Qaeda's leaders, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, they found themselves really mediating between these groups in Iraq, and they failed to unite them. Then there were other groups that emerged on the scene, jihadi groups, which pledged their allegiance to Osama bin Laden and acquired the al-Qaeda brand. And here again, we find from the letters that neither bin Laden nor his associates were able to influence these groups. Particularly, if you remember, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, it was reported to be the kind of the group that was most loyal to al-Qaeda, that somehow bin Laden would utter a word and it would carry his strategy, and none of that was happening. In fact, they gave al-Qaeda a headache. They even came out to say that they were part of al-Qaeda without consultation. They found out about it from the news.
Al-Qaeda found out about it.
Al-Qaeda found out about it from the news. They took the name and without even consulting. And so we find bin Laden writing to these jihadi leaders, practically really telling them about the 101 of what it means to be al-Qaeda, and educating them about the importance of global jihad, and trying. What was interesting about the letters that was going from bin Laden and his associates to these regional jihadi groups is their insistence: you should be doing less terrorism, not more terrorism. That doesn't mean that they were, we're not going to, I'm not going to romanticize al-Qaeda at the moment, but clearly, as you noted earlier, bin Laden and his associates were interested in attacking the United States, not the local attacks. And clearly they wanted them to be much more sophisticated in their plannings, and some of these regional jihadi groups were attacking Muslims in their mosques and being opportunistic about the attacks, attacking people in the marketplace. And, we'd read about all these attacks that would result in hundreds of Muslims, dying, being killed indiscriminately. In that, we find bin Laden by 2010 saying, surely they should have stopped these attacks. They have become, he says, the Muslim public has become repulsed by these attacks, in one letter. So clearly, whatever influence he wanted to have, he was failing at exerting his influence.
It's also true that in this post 9/11, post-Afghanistan period for al-Qaeda, there were terror attacks that at least Western intelligence agencies attributed to al-Qaeda: the Madrid bombing, the London bombing, others as well. You find no trace of any al-Qaeda, at least from bin Laden's side, no trace of any influence of bin Laden, awareness of bin Laden, planning by bin Laden for these attacks. So, what was it, just an assumption on the part of Western intelligence agencies that this must be al-Qaeda in spite of the fact that there was no evidence? Or was there reason, even if attenuated, to think, well, sure, this is al-Qaeda?
So let me be as fair as I could about some of the intelligence assessments. Because of the complex process of exchanging these letters, it was impossible for the intelligence community to know about the communications between bin Laden and his associates. So that it is, the intelligence community is forgiven for not knowing where bin Laden was and so on. But in terms of attributing so many of these attacks to al-Qaeda, they should have known better, particularly because quite a lot of the communications that took part, that was happening between al-Qaeda's leaders from North Waziristan to the regional jihadi groups, they should have known that al-Qaeda couldn't have been behind these attacks. As I said earlier, we find in these letters really al-Qaeda's leaders warning and begging and pleading pleading with these regional jihadi groups not to be doing these attacks. Beyond that, in terms of whether it's the 2004, 2005 bombings or the attempted plots in 2006, liquid bombs on planes, we find throughout these letters across all these years, not only that we don't find references that there were any role that al-Qaeda played, but we find them learning about some of these attacks from the news. We find, for instance, in 2009, when Abu Dujana al-Khurasani killed 7 CIA officers in Khost, Afghanistan, they found out about it from the news. They had nothing to do with it. So they were mainly spectators. There isn't a single reference that suggests that al-Qaeda was behind these attacks. Just to be clear, in 2004, when bin Laden managed to resume contact with his associates, he had plans to attack the United States. He wanted to, he planned all these attacks that against locomotives in the United States and to blow up these trains. We know about other attacks that he wanted to plan for the future. They're all in the letters, but the 2004, his plans, by the time, he sent them these plans and hoped that they would be able to carry them out, they informed him, hey, we've got, we can't do anything. We're afflicted here. And so instead of him asking them to do the plans, to carry out the plans, you need to go and hide until such time that you could be able to be operational later. And we find, letters 2006, 2007, 2008, all the way up into 2011, finding them that he's itching for more terrorism and they're complaining that we can't do anything. So much so that in 2010, he's writing, he says, unless al-Qaeda changes its strategy, we're already gone. We would come to an end if we don't do anything. So I can't see them being behind these attacks when all the references that we have, the letters that exist, that were recovered, al-Qaeda's leaders complaining about their situation and their inability to carry out attacks.
You switch a little bit because everyone's in hiding, including Osama bin Laden. How would you describe the life he led in hiding, at least in terms of the Abbottabad period, where he has this compound that's been built for him? He has, at least in the early years, these trusted bodyguards who are conducting relations with the outside world on his behalf, so whatever shopping or other things. Over the course of the years, members of his family, 3 of his 4 wives, wind up with him, the last of those arriving shortly before the May 2011 raid. What was the domestic situation in hiding, not just for him at that point, but for a growing group? I think by the end of it, there were over a dozen children in the compound and so on and so forth. How would you describe the life that he was living?
So by the time of the raid, there were 16 people in his own compound. 9 of the 16 were children. And here we find there were his children, his own children, 5 of them, as well as his grandchildren. Here, I think the documents also paint a very vivid picture about what was happening in the compound, what the children, how they were homeschooled, what they were reading, how they were playing. We find, this is probably surprising, but it turns out that all the public statements that we've heard bin Laden deliver over the years were effectively co-authored with his 2 daughters, Maryam and Sumaya, as well as his 3rd wife, Siham. One of the first letters that I read when the CIA declassified those thousands of files that I noted earlier, the first letter was from his wife, Siham, writing to her daughter, who was in North Waziristan. And she tells her, I'm writing to you in haste because I'm busy preparing the public statements with your father. So clearly, bin Laden's daughters and his wife did quite a lot of the heavy lifting.
Let me just come in there because, as you describe it in the book, the traditional role of women in the jihadi movement is that mothers encourage their sons to jihad, wives breed love of jihad in their own sons, but they are in the home and they are not public figures in any way. And yet, and some of this may have to do, and it's implicit in some of the references you make to bin Laden's views of his own sons, at least the ones he was in touch with, they don't really seem up to the task. And he relies much more on the daughters for their acumen in writing, in sort of crafting statements, and in how to really provide an effective message. And he acknowledged this and did rely on them very clearly. So that's a little bit off-brand, if you will, for that movement.
It is. Though, in some ways, it's probably because we didn't know enough about the domestic role of women. The reason why we didn't know enough is because women are not part of the public face of al-Qaeda and jihadi groups. They don't come out in public. They don't put out their statements. But according to all the writings that we know of them, is that, as you said, we know them as mothers, as sisters. They need to be supportive of jihad. They need to bring up their children on the love of jihad. And they need to shame their husbands and their sons and their fathers if they don't take up jihad. That's what we know about them. But do they write their husband's public statements? That I didn't know. Or their father's public statements? I didn't know about that. And this is really the very first time that we get this domestic insight into what they were doing at home. Now, clearly, Khalid, his son Khalid, he was in the compound. He did help a bit, but clearly he wasn't as competent as Maryam and Sumaya. And we know about this because when his wife, his second wife, Khayriya, who had been detained in Iran for about 10 years, she joins him in February 2011, just a few months before the raid. She's writing to her son Hamza, who is still in North Waziristan, and she writes to him about what was happening in the household. And in her letters, she tells him about the fact that Maryam and Sumaya's writings are broadcast on TV, meaning that when bin Laden delivers these statements, they're the ones writing them. So, and we know the letters from his wife, Siham. Then she tells him also about Khalid, whose interest, he had been for years wanting to get married, and imagine him having been stuck at home, couldn't do anything. They didn't really leave the compound just to evade the authorities. Khalid had a cow. He looked after the cow. They had some chicken that he was also looking after. Because of all the security measures that they needed to follow, they baked their own bread. They purchased grains and legumes in bulk so that the bodyguards who had been complaining for years about the security measures that they too had to follow, that they would not burden them with much except for fruit and vegetables. These were the regular things that they needed to have. But beyond that, they needed to be as self-sufficient as possible in that compound. So you can say, particularly for the children, they tried to give the children as normal a setting as can be in these very abnormal situations. I mean, the children were not allowed to play outside without being supervised by an adult. The reason being is because they didn't want anybody speaking Arabic outside, because as far as the Pakistani authorities were concerned, only 2 Pakistani brothers were living there with their families. So having children speak Arabic outside would have really brought the attention of the Pakistani authorities and possibly tracked him down.
It's really astounding, the contrast between what the life was and what we would have imagined it to be. I spoke to somebody who actually visited the compound a week later. They did an intelligence sweep after the fact. And, you know, what he described essentially was just shock at the sort of degraded level of life that was going on in there. There were certainly, it seems, too many people for the space that they were in. But one of his wives, on the other hand, who made it a condition of her marriage to him that she continue her studies, had a PhD in Quranic grammar, and she was the one who was organizing the curriculum. You found her curriculum among the documents.
That's right. It was Peter Bergen who found that she had done a PhD in Quranic grammar, but I found the curriculum that she was teaching in the compound and the plans that the children went through during the day, what they were studying, the break that they took either for lunch or for prayer. During the religious holidays, the children would elocution poetry, and bin Laden would give prizes afterwards. They liked some stories. He would read them stories in the evening. They enjoyed playing with the cats. So you get to some of the videos that they were watching. We got to see quite a vivid portrait of what was happening in the compound at times, because the grandchildren that were there, bin Laden's daughter, she was 19 and she died while giving birth. And so, while she was in Waziristan.
This was her fourth child.
That was her fourth child at the age of 19. And so they pleaded with the husband to send the grandchildren so that they would be raised in Abbottabad. And they did. That would have been end of 2007. And there were already bin Laden's children from his Yemeni wife. We don't hear from her. She must have been very busy in that compound. But her daughter, Safiya, the oldest, she seemed to have been quite affectionate with bin Laden's grandson, and she would tutor him. She was probably about a year older than him, and she was tutoring him. Clearly, the women are quite impressive, whether young and old, in the compound.
It's quite remarkable. Let's talk a little bit about the bodyguards. And, you know, again, they're responsible for protecting him. Yet, as you say, over the years, the burden of this and the fact that they had to live essentially as sheltered a life as he did in order to protect him, in order not to call attention to them, this became too burdensome for them, and they wanted out. And so you recount, because the documents reflect this, negotiations he had with the bodyguards, trying to get them to agree that more family members should come, and them refusing, and him realizing there's nothing he could do about it. So, you know, that's a reversal of what we would expect, no?
So the man who was terrorizing the world with his speeches was living in terror, and the bodyguards were terrorizing bin Laden. So I mentioned his daughter who was living in North Waziristan. She would have loved to come and join and live with the family. They didn't allow it. I don't know what the negotiations were that allowed her children, but they must have pleaded with them to do so. They wanted Khalid to be able to go and get married and bring his wife. Again, they didn't allow it. At the end, what was really testing bin Laden is that his wife, Khayriya, after she was released from Iran, he wanted her to join him for a very long time. They wouldn't allow it. They vetoed it. And he had given up on having her by his side. But then eventually, sometimes in January, we have the fighting between him and them was such that he was so scared to be able to have a conversation one-on-one with them. They were next door. So we have a couple of letters in which he tells them, you know, I decided, because in order to calm things down, I decided to write to you. And clearly from the letters that he was writing to them, it sounded like they had been yelling at him, and they were quite they were quite concerned, and they didn't want to negotiate with him. And
can I just interrupt? Because you quote
Sure.
from one of the letters that he's writing to the bodyguards. This is after a dispute. Clearly, there's been an argument. He says, if there are other issues that, and you put in parentheses, I said and annoyed you, and Brother Amir, who's someone else, did not let me know about them, I implore you to let me know. If I was in the wrong, I will apologize. And if you misunderstood my intention, I will clarify it. And so he really is afraid of what could happen if they walked out the door.
well, they threatened to abandon him. Now, just to be fair to the
Well, they
bodyguards,
had their families with
That's
them
right,
too.
that's
They had
right.
their wives and children. So they
That's
were
right.
all being subjected to this regimen.
absolutely, they had to follow stringent security measures. And imagine, being looking after the world's most wanted man, and the security measures that they needed to follow. And they wanted out. And as early, at least since 2009, they asked him that they wanted to find. They wanted him to find replacements, and he had been trying. We know from the letters that he had been writing to his associates, seeking replacements. Now, the kind of people he wanted them to have clean records, people who were who knew about business, who had money. So the job description and the criteria were impossible for an Al-Qaeda spy.
The pay was not very good.
No,
either.
of course not. Well, bin Laden didn't have much money. By the end, he didn't have money. He didn't have much money on him. So clearly, one has to be sympathetic to the bodyguards and why they wanted out. And but eventually, we learned from the letters that they reached an agreement that he undertook. He pledged that he would release them after the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Just stay with me until then, and by the 10th anniversary of 9/11, he would have found a replacement. And because these pledges of agreements are very important, particularly in Islam, that you need to fulfill your agreement. You wouldn't want to violate an agreement that you made. So they took it at face value and believed him that he would release them within a short time, and they decided to stick around. Now, speaking of agreement, they themselves had made a pledge to be supportive of bin Laden and to be supportive of Al-Qaeda. So from their perspective, also, they had an obligation, they had a duty. So they weren't going to let go, and they remained loyal until the very end, even though they were declining and vetoing many of the decisions that he had asked, particularly when he wanted to have more family join them.
Well, to be fair to them, if that's the right way to put it, they actually gave their lives to protect him.
At the end, they died.
They were killed by the SEALs,
That's right.
as was one of their wives.
That's right.
And so, in spite of these differences, now there's so much to talk about, but Iran comes up as a place that was a refuge, but also a prison for many of the escaping al-Qaeda leaders and others who had, after the U.S. came in and it was all coming apart, the Mullah Omar told them to leave Afghanistan. If they went to Pakistan, if they could get to the territories, they might be safe, but they saw the problems eventually of the drones and everything else, or the Pakistanis would catch them. So Iran became a way out for many of them, including some of the important leaders. And how would you characterize that relationship? Because it was used in terms of American policy statements at the time. It was used as a way of saying there was an alliance between al-Qaeda and Iran. There's nothing in these letters that indicates it's an alliance at all. It's essentially house arrest, if not worse, under most circumstances. But what were the Iranians' motivation in allowing this to happen in the first place?
So just a general point. Al-Qaeda is not just a non-state actor, it's against states. They don't recognize the legitimacy of states. So they were not receiving any support, not from Pakistan, not from Iran, not from Saudi Arabia. They were this, but the letters do give us a blow-by-blow description about what happened, particularly in Iran. So in the immediate aftermath of, well, not immediate, but by December 2001, the Taliban regime collapsed. Mullah Omar orders the Arabs to evacuate completely from Afghanistan because he came under a lot of pressure from tribal leaders. So here we have all these Arabs who are not just fighters, really. They were not fighters, just fighters. They had their families, often with multiple wives and their children, who had nowhere else to go. They had to follow the order of Mullah Omar because he was the commander of the faithful. They had no choice but to leave Afghanistan.
They had recognized that previously.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So initially, they were not al-Qaeda. The first wave, many of jihadi fighters with their women and children, they crossed into Iran. Iran, in that very first wave, we know from the letters that they dealt with the embassies of these people. They wanted to arrange for them to leave as soon as possible. So they dealt with the Gulf states, with the embassies of those Gulf states. They dealt with China, Malaysia. It wasn't very clear to Al-Qaeda, in Al-Qaeda's letters, as to whether these countries were turning a blind eye or not. But they wanted to ship them out of Iran as quickly as possible. They were not interested in having them there. And some of these jihadis, they were not really complying with the security measures or with the requests of the Iranian government. They wanted to use the telephone and so on. So they became a trouble for the Iranians. But that first wave, they wanted to get them out of Iran, and they managed to do that. Now, from Al-Qaeda's perspective, they didn't. Iran was not their first choice. Their first choice was to go into Pakistan, and which is what they did. Initially, their first option was to go to Waziristan and to other areas, to other cities of Pakistan. Here, they found that the Pakistani authorities had launched a comprehensive campaign, according to the letters, in major and small cities, and they arrested 600 brothers, and many others were martyred. So clearly Pakistan was not on their side. They couldn't count on the Pakistani authority. So some of Al-Qaeda's leaders crossed illegally into Iran. Part of these leaders, part of those from Al-Qaeda were bin Laden's family, his second wife, Khairia, his sons, their son, and 6 of their children from his first wife, Najwa. So they went along with others. They were assisted, as I said, illegally. They were assisted by Sunni militants in Iran. They're referred to in the letters as the Baluch brothers. Now, these Baluch brothers were happy to purchase mobile phones and help the Arabs rent places, and they managed, and they were very disciplined. They didn't use the telephones. They kept a low profile, and they were able almost to stay under the radar for almost a year. They would have left in February 2002, that's my estimate, but by December 2002, the Iranians had tracked them down. How did they track them down? They started tracking the Baluch brothers, who knew that they would be able to get them to Al-Qaeda, and they arrested the men, and then initially they put the women under house arrest and allowed some visits. Now, this became problematic because whenever the women were trying to visit their sons and husbands, they would take in some telephones with them, and that gave the Iranian authorities some trouble. So they ended up having all these compounds where everybody lived in the same place. But we know that the conditions were horrible, to say the least, because the Iranian authorities kept neglecting the medical needs of the children as well as the women. And in 2008, bin Laden didn't know clearly about the situation until 2008, when his son Saad ended up escaping from detention in Iran and managed to get to North Waziristan, where he wrote a 15-page letter to his father detailing what happened from 2002 up until 2008. And here we find that the detainees had tried to, rebelled inside those detention camps. They rioted, that bin Laden's daughter was being hit by the guards. It was clearly, we know that a woman died because they kept neglecting to take her to the hospital. We know that bin Laden's son's, Saad's wife, she lost her, she was pregnant, and they didn't take her to the hospital until after she lost the baby. So clearly the conditions were absolutely miserable. And the next time we hear about, or what really prompted the knowledge about what Iran was doing, is because bin Laden's daughter, Iman, ended up escaping as well. And she went to the Saudi embassy, and this became public. For a very long time, al-Qaeda didn't talk about the detainees in Iran, simply because the Iranians were holding them as a bargaining chip. So they kept quiet about them. But clearly, there was absolutely no support from the Iranian government for al-Qaeda. The detention the conditions in detention were miserable.
Yeah. Let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. Wait for the microphones, please. Hang on one second. The gentleman in the back there, right there.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. My name is Adrian. I'm a NYU graduate student studying global affairs with a focus on transnational security. Throughout history, I wrote this down, that's why I'm looking at it. Throughout history, there have been some infamous names, and bin Laden is undoubtedly one of them, at least from a Western perspective. Infamous names. In your opinion, in your professional opinion, do you feel we will see another figure like bin Laden today? Thank you.
I don't do predictions. I try to read texts and analyze them. I'm better at doing that. But certainly, his determination, his goals were unique to him. He was an impressive planner, but a failed terrorist leader, because at the end of the day, he failed to deliver on his goals. And most importantly, he didn't understand the limits of terrorism, and he should have known better. So, I think the world, there are always figures who are disruptive to the world. But I do want to say, and this comes out at the end of the book, without diminishing what bin Laden did, the importance of what he did, quite a lot of what happened post 9/11 was because some of the failures on various parts of intelligence agencies to assess how minuscule he should have been. So I don't want to give him too much credit in terms of his role. He certainly changed the world, the politics of the world, but not the way he wanted. What happened ends up being what other states decided to do, but not what he wanted to deliver.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm curious as to if there's anything in the letters about why Abbottabad, which I believe was 1 block away from the military academy of Pakistan, seems a little suspicious to me. You say that the Pakistan government was searching for him and not supporting him, but I wonder if there were elements in the military or the intelligence agency or the ulama or somewhere in Pakistan that was supporting him, chose that location. If there's any indication at all in the letters about something like that?
All references in the letters make it clear that he was fearful of being tracked down by the Pakistani authorities. Throughout the letters, we find his palpable hatred of the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence. So from the perspective of the Pakistani authorities, there were 2 Pakistani brothers living in that compound. So he was effectively hiding in plain sight. He was confined to his compound, didn't step outside the compound. And as I said earlier, even the children weren't allowed to play outside. At a certain point, we find when he started to find out about what was happening in North Waziristan and how the drones were effective, he tells his associates, we really need to evacuate. Why don't you do for the brothers similar arrangements as I have here? And they respond to him saying that the brothers would rather get martyred here rather than being captured by the Pakistani intelligence. So from my perspective, there is absolutely no doubt that he was hiding from the Pakistani authorities. Now, in some references in the letters, he refers to the Pakistani brothers, but these are Pakistani brothers who were, as opposed to the Pakistani government, fiercely opposed to the Pakistani government. The reason why I'm also very doubtful about them knowing anything is because for a very long time, bin Laden, as well as Ayman al-Zawahiri, put out public statements calling on the Pakistani people to rise against their apostate government and so on. So if I were the Pakistani government, if I knew where he was, it would be in my interest to have him eliminated. Why would I want to keep him there if he is inciting people to rise above, against the Pakistani government?
Okay, a lot of questions. Right over there, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but how do you, as a researcher and a writer who has immersed yourself so much in the domestic life and all of the complexities of, a human and his family, how do you separate the figure that we know him as from all of the personal details that you have discovered and balance that for yourself?
Thank you for this question. For a very long time, I worked on treaties, ideological treaties. I read jihadi writings and tried to understand them on the inside. And I thought, this would be the same, more of the same. You be dispassionate and so on. But studying letters is a completely different matter, precisely for the reasons that you stated. And I found myself having to inhabit their world. I was mentioning to Cliff earlier that for some time, I was stuck for about a week. I didn't know why bin Laden chose a certain course of action. And I ended up finding it in the letters where they were negotiating a marriage for his son Khalid. So the personal and the political were very intertwined. There were moments some moments were more difficult than others. I remember it was during COVID and going through bin Laden's letters, his 2004 letters, when he was planning attacks to derail trains in the United States and had to get to know some of the vocabulary that I didn't know about trains. I could finish his own sentences at times. I read the poetry of his wife when she lost her daughter in North Waziristan. Very powerful poetry. I hope that I delivered in a book a dispassionate book. I included both the personal and the political. And my aim was to involve the reader in all the challenges that I felt, rather than to tell the reader how the reader should feel. This was very important for me because the easiest thing that we've done when we talk about bin Laden and so on is it's easy to criticize bin Laden. Very easy. But that would have been if just criticism and tell people, it's just like it would be insulting the intelligence of my reader. He was much more than that. But he wasn't as powerful as what we thought or what he projected himself to be. So by the end, I think I was able to cut him down to size, not on the matters that, mainly on the matters that were of importance to him. Not that he was a hypocrite. He wasn't a hypocrite. This is a man who sacrificed his fortune for the cause. His family was devoted to the same cause, and they believed themselves to be sincere. At no point throughout the letters did I come across any references that suggested to me that he would have sold out or that he would entertain a deal just to save himself or his family. But I cut him down to size on the basis of who he was, a terrorist leader, and who failed at that. And that was what I wanted to communicate. But I also hope that the readers got to think and analyze and feel for themselves, because there were many elements where I was surprised, I was moved, but I didn't want to tell the reader what to think. So I included as many of those moments or these references as I could, so to give the reader some agency.
I think that's as good a place to stop as any. I really do recommend, if we've just scratched the surface here today, and there is much more on all of these questions and many others. The Bin Laden Papers by Nelly Lahoud. And please join me in thanking Nelly.